Bravo, easy 189 Zulu.
189 Zulu ground, hello, taxi Alpha Charlie and Lima Stand 23.
Alpha Charlie Lima 23, easy 189 Zulu.
Delivery, Logan 25 Bravo Romeo, good afternoon, ATR 76, stand 17 with uniform QNH 1026, request clearance to Ronaldsway.
25 Bravo Romeo, delivery, clears Ronaldsway, Eclad 1 Romeo, squawk 7644, EQNH 1027.
32 Ronaldsway on the Eclad 1 Romeo, squawking 7644, EQNH 1027, Logan 25 Bravo Romeo.
Logan 25 Bravo Romeo, thanks, that's correct. When you're ready, contact ground 121.855.
Very well, ready, call ground 121.855, Logan 25 Bravo Romeo, cheers. Very good day, about 496 Charlie, vacated Bravo Delta.
About 496 Charlie ground, good afternoon, taxi Alpha to signature.
Right, Alpha to signature, about 496 Charlie. Ryanair 9 Kilo Lima, stand 1, wave receipt of uniform 1026, requested clearance to Palmer, please.
9 Kilo Lima, delivery, good afternoon, clear Palmer, Sample 1 Romeo, squawk 5230, new QNH 1027.
5230, new QNH 1027, Ryanair 9 Kilo Lima.
9 Kilo Lima, that's correct. When you're ready, contact ground 121.855.
Wilco 121.855. Touch ground, Logan 25 Bravo Romeo, stand 17, Aircraft 1 Romeo, request push and start.
Logan 25 Bravo Romeo, ground tax, push start, please stand 17.
Approved, stand 17, Logan 25 Bravo Romeo.
Register delivery, good evening, Turkish 7, Victor Sierra Gate 32, SID, Sonic 1 Romeo, fully ready for startup.
Victor Sierra, thanks. Control position, contact me again on ground 121.855, call sign up, please.
11855, call sign, Turkish 7, Victor Sierra. Turkish 7, Victor Sierra, good evening.
Victor Sierra, ground, push start, food stand 32, QNH 1027.
We start approach stand 32, QNH 1027, Turkish 7, Victor Sierra.
Read the vehicle for a follow me through November Bravo in a couple of minutes, please.
Ground leader 1.
This is an EasyJet, stand 28 just vacated, I'm going to take him via November Bravo.
Copy, 28 via November Bravo, leader 1. And Easy 45 Yankee Tango.
Easy 45 Yankee Tango, ground, good afternoon, taxi Alpha, Delta, and Echo to Echo 3.
Alpha, Delta, and Echo to Echo 3, Easy 45 Yankee Tango. Logan 25 Bravo Romeo, request taxi Able Hotel.
Logan 25 Bravo Romeo, Roger, taxi by Juliet Echo and taxi to Hotel 1.
Taxi by Juliet Echo and to Hotel 1, Logan 25 Bravo Romeo, hi.
There's a follow me at Echo 3, it'll take you through November Bravo, then it's a right turn to stand 28.
November Bravo, stand 28, Easy 45 Yankee Tango.
Bravo Romeo, contact tower 118.630.
Contact the tower 118.630, Logan 25 Bravo Romeo, have a good night.
You too.
Victor Sierra request taxi.
Sierra, thanks, stand left, taxi via Delta, Papa, Kilo and Juliet, Juliet 1.
Delta, Papa, Kilo, Juliet, Juliet 1. Turkish 7 Victor Sierra.
Sierra, hold at Juliet 1, contact tower 118-1630.
Hold at Juliet 1, contact 118-630. Have a good evening, Turkish 7 Victor Sierra.
to shuttle 3 Victor, the MS320 on stand 42, we're a blue 320 Neo, and we have current information with QNH1026, we are ready for London Heathrow.
3 Victor, thanks for 12 position, contact ground 121.855.
1855, shuttle 3 Victor, cheers. Hello, shuttle 3 Victor, stand 42.
3 Victor, ground push start through South Part 2 and QNH1027.
Clear the push to start, and 1027 QNH is set. Shuttle 3 Victor.
Good afternoon, Finnair 50 kilo.
50 kilo ground, hello, taxi via Alpha, Delta, Echo, and November Charlie, sub 26.
Via Alpha, Delta, Echo, November Charlie, stand 26, Finnair 50 kilo.
stand 1, we're ready for push and stop.
9 Kilo Lima, ground, thanks, push start 3 stand 1.
Push start 3 stand 1, running 9 Kilo Lima. Ground, hello, Tomjet. 819 Papa, vacated Bravo Delta.
Tomjet 819 Papa, ground, good evening. Taxi via Alpha Delta, Echo and November Charlie, stand 239er.
Alpha Delta, Echo, November Charlie, 239 Tomjet. 819 Papa. 36, request taxi.
3 Victor, thank you. Turn left taxi to Juliet 1.
Left turn out taxi to Juliet 1. Shop 3 Victor.
It's Tuesday, the 18th of January, and effective midnight tonight, over 80 airports across the nation are effectively not authorized to allow pilots to fly Category 2 and Category 3 instrument approaches into those airports due to possible interference from the 5G wireless rollout, effectively limiting the weather capability of these airports to 1/2 mile visibility. If the weather drops to less than 1/2 mile, these airports will not be authorized to allow those aircraft to land, which could potentially cause a huge backup in air traffic across the country. There's nothing like putting off your homework and your research until the last moment to turn a problem into a major national crisis. My name's Juan Brown. You're watching the Blanco Lirio channel. Let's get into this. I first broke down this problem back in November on this channel about the possible interference between the new 5G wireless rollout and aviation, specifically the radio or radar altimeters in the airplane. The radio or radar altimeters in the airplane is what gives us the capability to do auto land approaches, approaches in very low visibility conditions. It will give us the very critical, very accurate altitude information we need to properly align and flare the aircraft and touch it down perfectly all by itself and come to a complete stop on centerline without the pilot touching the controls. These radio altimeters were designed and authorized by the FAA and industry years ago to operate in a narrow band of frequencies with no interfering neighbors near this frequency band. Until recently, the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, sold for billions of dollars some frequency bands very close to the radio frequency that the radio altimeters operate in. The radio altimeter only uses about 1 watt of power. And to this date, nobody has completed an exhaustive study to determine how resistant to frequency interference these radio altimeters are. So to get a better idea of where we stand today, how we got to this crisis point, we got to look at the major players. First, you've got the 5G wireless telecom community, which wants to expand to 5G, the 5G network. In order to do that, they need increased bandwidth. They need an increased number of frequencies. The power that the systems uses is limited already. So in order to get faster internet service, they need more bandwidth, more frequencies. Now, as these frequencies begin to impinge upon that of aviation operations, we have the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, which fundamentally does not have the manpower or technical capability or funding to research thoroughly the potential problems of interference between the 5G and the radio altimeters. There is, however, an advisory committee of volunteers, the RTCA, the Radio Technical Commission for Aeronautics. These are the engineers, the electrical engineers, that are sticking around in a voluntary capacity to help guide the FAA on matters such as this. Now, the RTCA did do some preliminary research on this and did conclude that yes, in fact, there may be a problem with interference between 5G and radar and radio altimeters in the aviation industry. The telecom industry immediately rejected the RTCA report, saying it was insufficient and inconclusive, but the telecom industry offered no substantial evidence of their own that would prove that this interference problem would not be a problem. The telecom industry does not fundamentally understand how radio and radar altimeters in aircraft were designed or how they operate. So in response to growing public pressure, the FAA back in December issued an Airworthiness Directive to aircraft operators, and we'll go inside and take a look at it, that tell operators that if a particular airport instrument approach is NOTAM closed due to possible 5G interference, you cannot fly that instrument approach. And effective midnight tonight, there's going to be NOTAMs, notices to airmen, that effectively shut down the use at over 80 airports, those instrument approaches that would require the use of the radio or radar altimeter. So, in effect, if the weather is less than Category 1 ILS minimums, in other words, less than 1/2 mile visibility, the metal is not going to move. And this can potentially cause huge backups across the entire country because there's so many aircraft flying at one time across the country. Once one airport is impacted, that backs up across the entire country. And airline CEOs are in the news this morning explaining how this can cost the airline industry potentially millions of dollars in lost revenue. Let's go inside and take a look at these NOTAMs and airworthiness directives. Okay, here's the Airworthiness Directive that fundamentally changes the limitations to transport and commuter category airplanes that have radio or radar altimeters on board. The FAA is adopting a new AD to all transport and commuter category aircraft equipped with a radio, also known as radio altimeter, a radar altimeter. This AD was prompted by a determination that radio altimeters cannot be relied upon to perform their intended function if they experience interference from wireless broadband operations in the 3.7 to 3.98 gigahertz frequency band. That's the new 5G C band. This AD requires revising the limitations section. That's one of the most important sections of the entire manual of your aircraft, of the existing aircraft manual, to incorporate limitations prohibiting certain operations requiring radio altimeter data when in the presence of 5G C-band interference as identified by a NOTAM, a Notice to Airmen. And that's what's happening today, is these NOTAMs are coming out for all of these different airports. And here's the Airworthiness Directive as shown in all of our manuals now, including in my Boeing 777 manual, and it says, when operating in U.S. airspace, the following operations requiring radio altimeters are prohibited in the presence of 5G C-band broadband interference as identified by NOTAM, and the NOTAMs will be issued to state the specific airports where the radio altimeter is unreliable due to the presence of the 5G C-band wireless broadband interference. And here's the prohibited operations if these airports are NOTAMed. Special Authorization Category 1, Special Authorization Category 2, Category 2 and Category 3 approaches, RNAV RNP approaches with authorization required, automatic landing operations. By the way, these aircraft need to have periodic, about every 90 days, you got to perform a auto land on the airplane, regardless of the weather, just to keep the system operational and logged that it is correctly operating. That's going to cause a backup there too. You can't even do a practice auto land approach if this NOTAM is in effect. Also, manual flight guided control systems, including heads-up display, that's how the 737 performs these approaches, and the use of enhanced vision systems to touchdown under the FARs. Hang on, breaking news. Just as I was getting this report out, the bluff has been called, and the telecoms, the 5G, will not deploy near airports. The NOTAMs that I'm looking for are now being lifted for all these various airports. But I did get a snapshot of the NOTAM before it was rescinded, and here's what it looked like for Sacramento Airport, our local airport, which does frequently go down for weather below a half mile. But earlier today it said that effectively at 5Z, that was going to be 9 o'clock tonight local time, the Special Authorization Category 1 approach, Category 2 and Category 3 approaches were all NA, not authorized, unless you have an alternate method of compliance with the Airworthiness Directive that we just talked about. Also, all radio altimeter, SMF radio altimeter unreliable, auto land, heads-up display to touchdown, enhanced flight vision systems to touchdown, helicopter operations requiring radio altimeter data to include hover and autopilot, not authorized unless you had a alternative method of compliance with the Airworthiness Directive that we just mentioned. So, crisis averted while we're putting this report together. This is exactly what we're looking for, is we're looking for at least a 2-mile buffer of this 5G technology from the final approach course on these airports that have the Category 2 and Category 3 instrument approach procedures in place. Wow. Talk about crisis by management. There's got to be a better way to do this. Thanks so much for your support of this channel, especially over on Patreon, that make this content possible. We'll see you here. It's Tuesday, November 23rd. My name's Juan Brown. You're watching the Blanco Lirio channel, and today we're going to get into the consequences of the expansion of the 5G network and the possible implications with automatic landing capability of airliner-type aircraft, specifically interference with radar altimeters. As a 777 pilot, I'm required to remain current and qualified to do what's called automatic landing, a Category 3 landing in the Boeing 777. And just the other day, we did one coming into Los Angeles as the weather was deteriorating enough to where the weather was beginning to get below Category 1 minimums, about a half-mile visibility, and so we decided to let's go ahead and set up for the worst case scenario and do a Category 3 auto land, which gives us the ability to land in as little as 300 feet runway visual range or visibility down the runway. It's basically a landing almost in the blind. There's no decision height or altitude associated with this approach. You are simply allowing the aircraft to do the landing itself. In order for the aircraft to do the landing itself, it has to have triple redundant systems all working perfectly in order to perform this maneuver. Then my job as the first officer is to simply monitor this equipment, and if in the event anything goes wrong during the final approach portion and the green light for Category 3 landing goes away, I simply just say go around. We don't argue about it. We don't try to figure it out. We just go around because we do not have time to troubleshoot and then sort out the problem after we've safely gotten away from the ground. Now, there's a lot of equipment on board the aircraft that help us do it. And again, it's got to be in a triple redundant format. But the one piece of critical equipment that can automatically land the aircraft for us is the radar altimeter. It's basically an analog piece of equipment that was designed, well, years ago, under certain specifications that were of the state of the art at the time, but now we've got a 5G network that is encroaching on the frequency range of these radar altimeters, creating a possible interference problem. Now, the radar altimeter is used for a wide variety of reasons in the aircraft, the auto landing being the most critical, and it also helps us out with things like terrain awareness, getting too close to the terrain. That's used with enhanced GPS information, or we call it GPWIS. It's also used in air traffic collision avoidance maneuvers. It's also used in wind shear avoidance maneuvers. All those different functions use the radar altimeter to some degree, but the most critical portion is auto land. The radio altimeter becomes effective at about 2,500 feet. The radio altimeter has a transmitter and a receiver on board the aircraft. This transmitter only puts out about 1 watt of power, of energy, to make this work. It sends out a pulse of energy, or a pulse of frequency, changing frequencies, that is reflected off the ground and received by the aircraft, and that difference in time is what determines the altitude of the aircraft straight down below the aircraft. At 300 feet to 200 feet, then the radar altimeter automatically calls off for us 50 feet, 40 feet, 30 feet, 20 feet. At 50 feet on an auto land with everything coupled up, it will automatically get the aircraft into the flare mode, and it will automatically cause the autopilot to perfectly flare the aircraft and touch down right in the touchdown zone, because you're also using the localizer signal for lateral deviation and the glide slope signal for vertical deviation. That, coupled with the radar altimeter reading the altitude above the ground, is what gives you the perfect auto land, and it really works well. I mean, that thing lands better than I can, and it's very impressive. It's nerve-wracking. You're on the edge of your seat. You're constantly get ready to go around. You're basically covering the toga switches, that if in the event anything goes wrong, you just hit the toga switch and go around. And the critical thing about an auto land is if something goes wrong in the final number of feet of the auto landing, you may initiate a go-around, say from 100 feet or 50 feet, and the aircraft will probably touch down. You will do a bounce and go off of the runway, and you better have that aircraft over the runway when you do that bounce and go, or touch and go. Now, in the past, this has been a concern with 3 and 4G wideband communications, cell phone communications, but now with 5G, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, is auctioning off a critical band of frequencies very close to the frequencies that our radar altimeter operates, and we'll go inside and take a look at this in closer detail here in a moment. So we've got four big factions that are involved in a power struggle over these frequency bands, and this has been an ongoing battle, and this is quite frankly how the sausage is made when it comes to regulating the airwaves. We all want 5G because, especially in urban areas, because we want higher speed internet. We want faster internet. We want to be able to watch the Blanco Lirio channel, and I want to be able to blast something up quickly. In order to do that, the telecommunications industry needs bandwidth. They can't make the devices any more powerful. That's already limited, but they need more frequencies. They need more bandwidth, and that's why they are making a grab for these frequencies near the radar altimeter band. So if you follow the money in this situation, you can see that there is huge money behind the telecommunications industry, and so the FCC and all the politicians, of course, they all want high-speed internet in their jurisdictions, and so the FCC, if you look at the document I'll post inside here, they very much want to auction off these frequencies to the telecommunications industry. On our side of the fence is the lonely FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, and they don't have exactly all the ability to understand exactly what all the implications are of this frequency merge, or this potential interference or conflict of frequencies. And so the FAA relies on a third party called the RTCA, the Radio Tele... I'm going to read it straight. And so the FAA relies on a third party called the RTCA, the Radio Technical Commission for Aeronautics. They've been around since the 30s, and they are a group of electronic engineers and peers, volunteer, that help the FAA with these sort of issues. And the RTCA has recently published an over 278-page report that points out the possible interference problems that this new 5G network may propose to the airlines and other forms of aviation, such as helicopters, because they need to use the radar altimeter for their TAWS systems, the train awareness systems. The helicopters need to get into these various hospitals in various weather, and they need that radar altimeter to work for them in those applications, and also for general aviation. Part 135 and some of the more sophisticated parts of general aviation also use radar altimeters. So the volunteer engineers and scientists at the RTCA have taken an initial look at the problem by basically bench testing a bunch of radar altimeters, and bench testing to the best of their ability to try to replicate real life scenarios. For example, real category 3 approaches, particularly the one into Chicago is what they modeled after, and add to that mix potential 5G interference from the very frequencies that the FCC is fixing to auction off here. And they have found that with a certain level of safety, of about a 6 decibel safety level, they have found that in their laboratory testing there is a high degree of possibility of interference. They were able to reproduce in the lab interference that could cause very much a problem for radar altimeters. Now, because this is only done on the bench, theoretical bench work, and not empirically derived, we'd have no real data from the real world of this yet. Right away, the 5G Americas, the group representing the telecommunications industry, immediately poo-pooed the report from the RTCA, saying that it was an unrealistic look at the problem, and of course that the 5G network will pose no problems whatsoever to the airline industry. I think we got another problem to look at. I hope Steve Dixon from the FAA takes a closer look at this and really listens to what those scientists at the RTCA are telling them about these possible interference issues. Let's go inside and take a closer look. First, let's start with a report from the RTCA. This is the advisory group of scientists and engineers to the Federal Aviation Administration. This was done in October of 2020, And it explains here the RTCA Incorporated is a not-for-profit corporation formed to advance the art and science of aviation and aviation electronic systems for the benefit of the public. This is the report that I believe holds the most water. And that question is shown right here. This is the frequency for our radar altimeters or radio altimeters, 4200 to 4400 megahertz. And the portion of the proposed 5G band goes from 3700 to about 3980 megahertz, leaving a little more than just 200 megahertz spacing between the desired 5G frequencies and the radio altimeter frequencies. And again, these radio altimeters only put out about 1 watt worth of power. Now this green line is interesting, and I had to employ the help of a retired electrical engineer to help me explain this. The slope of this green line represents the filtering capability of the modern day radar altimeters that already exist in today's fleet of aircraft. It is very hard, if not almost impossible, to create an iron door filter that prevents any kind of spurious emissions or interference from nearby neighboring frequencies. Each filter has a certain amount of slope to it to prevent interference. And where these two slopes meet, therein lies potentially a problem. So some of the various threats that these scientists studied were, the biggest threat is from the base station itself, or the use of telephones on the ground. That was pretty much determined to not be a factor, or the use of 5G telephones on board the aircraft. That's why the PAs regarding please leave your personal devices in airplane mode are so important. In that case, that did represent a serious threat to the radar altimeter on board the aircraft. Now, a thing to consider about these base stations is that the aircraft, remember, if the aircraft is at 1,000 feet, that signal has to drop down 1,000 feet, reflect off the ground, and return to the aircraft 1,000 feet, 2,000 feet total. The power of that signal is attenuated during that trip. The base station only needs to send the signal from the base station up to the effective altitude of 1,000 feet. So the aircraft is got a 2,000 foot distance to lose its power, get interfered with, whereas the base at one point the base station is going to win over the power of the base station is going to win over the power of the aircraft. Now, that being said, the base station is primarily designed to beam down to capture the cell phones of the people on the ground, and they're not necessarily aimed up at the aircraft. But what is going to be critical is the placement of these 5G base stations in and around locations of Category 3 ILS approaches at these major airports. Also around the various hospitals that helicopters need to use. As part of their report, they modeled the ILS Category 2 and Category 3 ILS runway 27 left at Chicago's O'Hare. Notice down here, Category 3, there are no minimums. RVR of 600 feet runway visual range. You're basically landing in the blind. There's no decision altitude, no decision height. The aircraft is going to automatically land. And they look at the geometry of this approach, and then they look at the placement of current 3G and 4G base stations, and basically converted these stations in the lab to 5G stations, putting out their nominal power, and what interference that might have on this instrument approach. They did the same thing with some of these helicopter hospital approaches in urban areas. This is in Houston. Now they break this report down into usage categories. Usage category 1, large fixed-wing aircraft, like the airlines. 2, small, medium fixed-wing aircraft. And 3, helicopters. And after pages and pages and pages of data, let's get to the main argument. And here we can find a summary of the results based off of the runway 27 left Category 2 and 3 approach, both for usage category 1 up here. This is the radar altimeter for airliners, the black line, with a 6 decibel safety barrier built into it, and we can see that interference does exceed these levels significantly right here at about 275 feet. Again, this is assuming that the existing 3 and 4G base stations were powered up as 5G stations right along the path of the final approach into Chicago. So for airliners, yeah, it even exceeds the primary power output of the radio altimeter itself here at 275 feet, and then it penetrates again into the safety zone here at 650 feet and around 1,000 feet. And for all of the light aircraft or medium-sized aircraft, the parameters were exceeded greatly. So they could expect a lot of interference for the smaller aircraft. And here they summarize what some of the outcomes may be. Remember, we have at least 2 radar altimeters in a auto-land capable aircraft. 1, both radar altimeters could become inoperative, or 2, one radar altimeter become inop while the other radar altimeter provides erroneous altitude readings. 3, both radar altimeters provide erroneous readings which do not agree. In these cases, the auto-land system is going to say no land 3, and you're just going to have to go around, and you'll be notified of that. And this one is kind of nefarious. Number 4, both radar altimeters provide erroneous altitude readings which are in agreement. Now, I don't know if the auto-land system will capture that, catch that, if both radar altimeters are in agreement, but they are wrong. For usage category 3, i.e. helicopters coming into the landing zones on hospitals, yes, they found interference levels that exceeded that of the safety margin built into the radar altimeters. So in summary, on page 88, this report says that this does represent a major risk of harmful interference to radar altimeters of all types of civil and commercial aircraft caused by 5G telecommunications in this frequency band of operational scenarios. And the FCC is reminded that, look, we were here first. The radar altimeters were here first. The 5G network is the new neighbor on the block, and that if interference is found to be true on the behalf of aviation, which was here first, then the 5G operation is obliged to either power back or shut down or move further away from the frequency range of the radar altimeters, because aircraft were here first. Next up is the 5G America's white paper. This is the telecommunications industry telling us that all is well, there will be no interference with radar altimeters, and yet they haven't done a single bit of testing themselves, as far as I can tell from this report. Instead, they are only disputing the report by the RTCA. This report gives us a broad overview of the 5G spectrum that they want to use, and that some 5G has already been employed overseas, and yet they have not, as of yet, received any reports of interference with radar altimeter operations overseas. And here they go over the specific frequencies they need or want to use. They basically need to build a bigger pipe to get more data through quicker. Now here in Chapter 4, they get specifically into radar altimeters and state that the FCC recognized that radio altimeters are a critical aeronautical safety of life system primarily used at altitudes under 2,500 feet, but concluded that well-designed equipment should not ordinarily receive any significant interference, let alone harmful interference, given these circumstances. Furthermore, the FCC noted that they expect the aviation industry to take account of the RF radio frequency environment that is evolving below the 3980 megahertz band edge and take appropriate action if necessary to ensure the protection of such devices. Well, this is where the FCC and the FAA don't quite see eye to eye or don't quite understand the process here, as everything on board an aircraft is FAA PMA TSO approved, parts manufacturer authorization and technical standard order. This takes time, loads of time. That's why technology is so slow to change in the aviation industry, is everything has to go through this process, unlike the FCC, what the FCC is used to. And so I would say, okay, well and good, broadband providers, are you willing to upgrade all of the radar altimeter devices in all the airliner aircraft before you start encroaching on these frequencies, or are you somehow willing to pay for this upgrade? Getting filters, remember, the airlines came here first. They were designed state-of-the-art at the time with no neighbors nearby. These filters will need to be changed significantly in order to minimize or prevent any interference as is currently being proposed by 5G. And then here in paragraph 4.2, they address the RTCA report specifically. In parallel, the aviation industry has been providing studies to the FCC during the proceeding. However, these studies have significant shortcomings, in particular engineering analysis dated on 7 October 2020 from the RTCA, that's the report we just got through discussing, was overly conservative when reevaluating real-world conditions. Conclusions of the study would be different as discussed hereafter. And the same is true for any other study that came along their way, according to 5G Americas. And then they proceed to pick apart the RTCA report without any engineering data derived by themselves. I want to see your math, 5G. Then here in chapter 4.4, they go on to provide some real-world examples where 5G has been deployed and there have been no reports yet of any interference in Japan, South Korea, or Europe. Now here's from the FCC, the mid-band spectrum auction. FCC begins mid-band spectrum auction October 5, 2021. The FCC today kicked off a mid-band spectrum auction to support next-generation wireless services, including 5G, in the 3.45 gigahertz band. Auction 1110 will make available 100 megahertz of continuous mid-band frequencies. From FCC Acting Chairwoman Jessica Rosenworcel, we are moving with record speed and collaboration to free up more mid-band spectrum for 5G. These airwaves are a critical part of unlocking the 5G promise everywhere in the country. I want to thank the FCC staff who have worked so hard to start this auction this year. And I want to thank our partners at NTIA and the Department of Defense for working with us to free up this spectrum of 5G. Bidding in the first phase of the auction will kick off at 10 a.m. And in this case, that number is so big, I can't even, is that $14,775,354,000 based on January 14th, 2021 estimate. So that's where that's not where the bidding starts. The huge money involved in this. As a result of this controversy, this has resulted in a delay in the game, a delay of 1 month. But look at the spending that's going on with this, the money behind this. Verizon Communications is spending $45 billion on the C-band auction, AT&T $23 billion, T-Mobile $9 billion. There's a lot of pressure to get this pushed through, a lot of investment pressure, and there's nothing the FAA can do in 1 month's time about this situation. We did, however, get a weekly written Special Information Airworthiness Directive. Stand by, let me find that. Here it is, Special Airworthiness Information Bulletin, AIR 21-18 from the FAA. This SAIB recommends that radio altimeter manufacturers, aircraft manufacturers, and operators voluntarily provide to federal authorities specific information related to the altimeter design, functionality, specifics, and deployment and the usage of radio altimeters on the aircraft, and that they test and assess their equipment in conjunction with federal authorities. Well, what test? Results from that testing and assessment should be reported to the appropriate civil authorities and spectrum regulators. The FAA is currently collaborating with the FCC and the NTIA, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, to assess the need for mitigation beyond the recommended action in this informational bulletin. They're so far behind on this. So they want radio altimeter manufacturers to test their equipment and determine their vulnerability to interference and their current filters on board their equipment. Aircraft manufacturers want to have all their radar altimeters tested and checked for the possibility of interference problems. And operators and pilots remind passengers that all portable electronic devices are allowed for transport, checked, and baggage should be turned off and protected from accidental activation. Remind passengers that all portable electronic devices in the cabin and any carried on the aircraft to be in non-transmitting mode or turn them off, in other words, airplane mode. Seek information from the manufacturers of the aircraft and radio altimeters on possible effects of interference. Operators should ensure their pilots are aware of the potential degradation of radio altimeter capabilities and any means to compensate for in-flight radio altimeter anomalies. Consider both erroneous altimeter readings and the loss of altimeter function. Great. How many of us are going to end up going around if in the event there is an interference problem, and how's that going to back up a backlog of traffic if this should become a problem? Operators should ensure their pilots are aware of the potential degradation of capability of safety systems and other equipment dependent on radio altimeters, like the TCAS and the JIP-WIZ and the wind shear alerting system. Operators should consider the potential loss of pilot trust in dependent aircraft safety systems in the assessment of existing and development of new crew procedures. We spend an extraordinary amount of time in the simulator teaching people to trust the instruments, trust the gauges, trust the equipment that you are given to work with here. And now we're throwing that trust right out the window potentially. Operators and pilots who experience radio altimeter anomalies should notify air traffic controllers as soon as practical. Reports should include as much detail as possible, include information to describe the anomaly. Should we'd like to, I don't know. This is an ongoing battle. It's not the first rodeo we've gone to with the FCC and radio frequencies. I hope this gives you a better understanding of what we're up against here in the industry with the encroachment of 5G into the radio frequency spectrum that is right next to that of radar altimeters in not only airliner type environments but also helicopter operations and general aviation as well. Again, thanks so much for your support of this channel over on Patreon that make this content possible. Pulling this kind of information together takes a lot of time. Thank you so much for your support. See the links below for all these reports. Let me know in the comments section below what you think, especially you electrical engineers out there. Take a good look at this data, especially the RTCA report, and see what you think. Let me know in the comments below. See you here.
Hello, my name is Al Season, and I'm the RTCA Vice President of Aviation Technology and Standards. Over the past several months, RTCA has been bringing you online webinars called Aviation Technology Connect. After our symposium had to be canceled in June, we wanted to find another way to keep you posted on the trends we see in our industry. The webinars are high-level discussions on topics like aviation safety, counter-UAS measures, commercial space, and ICAO perspectives. Those webinars have been very successful. Thank you. Today, we start an additional second series of webinars. This series will highlight the work of various RTCA committees at a deeper level. In so doing, we hope to reinforce for you the value of RTCA committees and the documents they produce. Today's webinar highlights the work of Special Committee 239, Low Range Radar Altimeter. The committee was formed in December 2019 and tasked with updating the current Minimum Operational Performance Standard for Low Range Radar Altimeters, DO 155. The committee is focused on protecting future radar altimeters from existing and future in-band and out-of-band interference. Following the committee's presentation on their work, there will be an interactive Q&A session. We encourage you to submit your questions via the Q&A panel on your screen. Speaking today will be the leadership team of Jean-Luc Robin, Seth Frick, and Dr. Sai Kalyana-Raman, as well as Terry McVenis, President of RTCA, who will moderate the Q&A session. You can find videos of our past monthly Aviation Technology Connect webinars on the RTCA YouTube channel. This webinar will be posted to that channel within a few days also. Today's webinar is brought to you by the generous sponsorship of Collins Aerospace, NBAA, American Airlines, and Garmin. We are grateful for their support. Please remember to look for the virtual handouts from today's webinar by clicking on the Documents icon. Those handouts include a link to RTCA's recently published white paper on assessment of C-band mobile telecommunications interference impact on low-range radar altimeter operations, the slides from today's presentation, and handouts from our sponsors at Collins, Aerospace, and Garmin. And now, I'll turn the webinar over to the SC239 leadership team. Thank you for tuning in.
Hello everyone, and thanks to RTCA for organizing this webinar. Today we'll be having a presentation and some discussion on the interference risk to radar altimeters from planned 5G telecommunications systems.
Hello everyone, I'm Jean-Luc Robin, and I'm the radio navigation expert at Airbus, and I'm serving as co-chair of SC239 along with Seth.
And this is Seth Frick. I'm a radar systems engineer at Honeywell, and as Jean-Luc mentioned, one of the Special Committee 239 co-chairs.
Good morning, good afternoon everyone. I'm Sai Kalyana-Raman. I'm a technical fellow at Collins Aerospace, and I support SC239 as secretary.
Okay, so to understand the issue of interference to radar altimeters, first and foremost, we need to have a good understanding of radar altimeters, how they work, and how they're used in civil aviation. So fundamentally, radar altimeters are exactly what they sound like. It is a full radar system. It's a downward-looking radar system with the antennas installed on the underside of an aircraft, which transmits an RF signal towards targets. In this case, the targets are the terrain or any obstacles that could be protruding above the terrain. And then the system receives a reflection of those signals off of those targets back at the receiver and measures the time delay to determine range to those targets. And in the case of an altimeter, the range to the terrain is going to be equal to the aircraft's altitude above ground level. And it's very critical to note that radar altimeters are actually the only sensor on an aircraft that can make that direct measurement of AGL altitude. So typically when you talk about altitude or an altimeter measurement on an aircraft, you're referring to something like a calibrated pressure altitude from a barometric altimeter or an air data system, or in some cases GNSS altitude. And in those instances, the altitude measurement is going to be referenced to some sort of absolute datum or reference point, for example, sea level or an ellipsoid height. So if the terrain that the aircraft is flying over is not equal in elevation to that absolute datum or reference point, then that information of absolute altitude doesn't provide any indication of the aircraft's clearance height or safe clearance height above the terrain or any obstacles. So the radar altimeter is very critical in its ability to provide that measurement directly, unlike any other altitude sources on the aircraft. So with that direct measurement of AGL altitude, the altimeter serves its most critical function, which is providing situational awareness of the terrain to the flight systems and pilots to prevent any sort of controlled flight into terrain or CFIT type of occurrence. And CFIT accidents are actually what really led to widespread use of radar altimeters in civil aviation beginning in the 1970s, including some high-profile accidents such as TWA Flight 514 in 1974, in which there were actually no survivors of that particular crash. 92 people on board, including passengers and the flight crew, all perished in that case due to a CFIT accident. So today, radar altimeters are ubiquitous across a wide range of civil aircraft, including not just commercial transport airplanes, but also business and general aviation airplanes, as well as helicopters. So radar altimeters operate in a global protected aeronautical spectrum allocation, in this case from 4.2 to 4.4 gigahertz. And within that band, they will typically employ either pulse radar technology, which is generally what most people think of when thinking of a radar system, emitting short bursts of RF energy and waiting for that pulse to be received back and measuring the time delay. Or actually what's more common in the radar altimeters used today in civil aviation is what's called frequency modulated continuous wave, or FMCW technology. So in this case, the radar altimeter, instead of emitting pulses, will actually be transmitting continuously with a 100% duty cycle. And the particular waveform that's used will include a series of linear frequency sweeps, or chirps, where the frequency is changed linearly over time, as shown in the figure on the bottom left here. So in this case, when the altimeter receives a signal, which is essentially a delayed and attenuated copy of the transmitted signal, we can just look at the frequency difference between those waveforms, and then knowing the slope of the linear FM sweeps, we can also determine the time delay, which will be directly proportional to that frequency difference. So this is usually done with what we call a homodyne or zero IF architecture in the RF system, in which case we actually take that transmitted signal and couple it off to feed the local oscillator of a mixer in the radar altimeter receiver, and then the output of that mixer after low-pass filtering is going to be a signal at the difference frequency between the transmitted and received signals. And then that again is, that frequency is going to be directly proportional to the time delay and thus the altitude. So with some amount of signal processing to determine the frequency of that signal, we can make an altitude measurement. And as mentioned before, radar altimeter usage is pretty ubiquitous these days in civil aviation. And the usage of altimeters has gone far beyond just providing that AGL altitude indication to the pilots on a display or something like that. In particular, on commercial transport airplanes and some of the higher end business and general aviation aircraft, the radar altimeter output is fed into a wide range of systems, safety and navigation systems on board the aircraft. So you have not only things like the Train Awareness and Warning System, or TAWS. The altimeter is also used to activate or inhibit functions in other sensors, such as wind shear surveillance in the weather radar. It's also used as a key input to TCAS, and it's also these days, very tightly integrated into the flight control systems, including functions such as automatic landing and auto throttle during approach and landing procedures. So all of these functions are, of course, very safety critical, and the radar altimeter plays a very key role in that. And then finally, the last thing that's important to understand regarding radar altimeters and how they're designed and operated is the actual requirements that are used to define their performance. So Generally, in civil aviation, radar altimeters will be certified at the equipment level through what's called the Technical Standard Order process, which is a pretty rigorous certification process that requires extensive validation and testing of the radar altimeter design against some standardized set of performance requirements. And those requirements may be defined in the TSO itself directly, or by reference to some outside industry standards, such as a minimum performance specification or minimum operational performance standard, or MOPS, as we call it. And those types of documents would be generated by typically an independent standards organization, groups such as RTCA or EuroK in Europe. And then those two groups, of course, often work very closely together in collaboration to develop those types of standards. Initially, the first set of standardized radar altimeter requirements for civil aviation were provided in TSO C87, which was released all the way back in 1966, and that document did include the requirements directly within it. The requirements in TSO C87 were ultimately essentially incorporated into an RTCA MOPS DO-155, which was released in 1974, and then that TSO C87 set of requirements stayed in effect all the way until 2012, when it was eventually superseded by TSO C87A. And C87A now references performance requirements in a EuroK MPS ED30, which was released in 1980. So even though the TSO was updated, the performance requirements themselves are still quite old in this case. So regardless of which set of requirements you're talking about, all of these standards have not had any real specific requirements regarding interference susceptibility or receiver masks or anything like that, other than just very general requirements regarding interoperability in multiplex installations on the same aircraft. So there's nothing really governing the out-of-band interference environment. And that may sound a little strange, but when you think that the last update to any of these requirements was 1980, what did the RF spectrum environment really look like way back then? Cell phones certainly didn't exist. The threat space was very different, and RF interference was not really considered to be the same type of threat at the time that it is today. And so with that, I'll hand it off to Jean-Luc to discuss in a little more detail what that RF spectrum environment looks like.
So thank you very much, Seth, for this comprehensive introduction. And so now what we will see before looking at what is going to be the future or RF environment, we will see the current radio frequency environment today. So basically the spectrum surrounding radar altimeters is dominated by fixed services and fixed satellite services. And so fixed services may have high radiated power, but as they are sparsely distributed, and they use highly directional antennas, so with very short and small beam width, the radio altimeter are not affected with these services today. And the second thing is the fixed satellite services. So the signals are coming from space and are largely attenuated by more than 30,000 kilometers away, so that we have very low interference at radio altimeter. So that radio altimeter are not affected today by fixed satellite services. We also have above the 4.4 GHz and aeronautical mobile telemetry used by federal organization today, and they are generally insulated to specific test ranges. So we have a table at the right with different regions. So currently high power interference so basically we have a quiet knife bore today, and we can have high power emission also coming from ground-based surveillance radar, but they are far from the band, and they are sparsely distributed also, and with very narrow beam width. So it's transparent to our radio altimeter. So, however, we have airworthiness standard, but regarding the high intensity radiated field, so we test continuous wave and pulse high power interference signal. However, we have an exclusion band. This exclusion band is allowed at plus or minus 10% around the band. So it means that this band that is not tested today, and that is not considered today in terms of interference, spans from 3.78 and 4.84 gigahertz. Therefore, today Earth requirements are not enough to protect our radio altimeter, and regarding the next ongoing modern communication that is coming closer and closer to the radio altimeter. So now, what is the evolution of the interference environment that we have to cope with? So in the mid-band, so radio altimeter lies in a very spectrum sweet spot, the mid-band. And this spot is very, very attractive because first here you have very interesting throughput capability for data rate, and at the same time you have very, very interesting propagation signal properties. So that everyone wants this band today, and especially a 5G mobile wireless application. So it's why United States and the FCC has made the mid-band spectrum a priority for 5G technology deployment. And this include band from 3.45 and to the 3.55 gigahertz, but also 3.7 to 3.98 gigahertz, which is close to our band. And this mid-band spectrum is extremely valuable. As you can see, the cost of the megahertz is very high. So this is the landscape of the worldwide 5G deployment, and as you can see, the radio altimeter is at the middle of 5G deployment. And especially you can see the USA, but also the Canada, the Australia, and the Japan, Europe, and UK, so China. So a lot of all country is establishing on this band. So with some ground band sometimes not, and with different level of power. So this has to be taken into account in the analysis. So now Sai is going to present you the study of the RTCI report that we have performed.
Thank you very much, Jean-Luc. Given the excellent backdrop that Seth and Jean-Luc set up in terms of what a radar altimeter does and some of the evolution of the spectral environment, we can get into the details of what was performed within the auspice RTCA. And while I'm getting into that, I'd like to provide a quick overview of the background of how we got here. Back in 2018, FCC had announced its plans to establish a new spectrum allocation for 5G and LTE systems in the band adjacent and below to radar altimeters. They were looking at utilizing the band between 3.7 and 4.2 gigahertz for that. Once this intent was announced, given that in the radar altimeter community, we understand the pushes and pulls of what spectrum compatibility is. There was some additional activity that was pursued within the auspices of ABSI, which stands for Aerospace Vehicle Systems Institute out of Texas A&M University, and we conducted initial testing and analysis to evaluate what the high-level risks would be for radar altimeter systems that are operating the band between 4.2 and 4.4 from 5G transmissions in the near band in the 3.7 to 3.98 gigahertz to begin with. We did understand that there was a plan to amortize the 3.7 to 3.98 gigahertz, and we focused on that as the scope of the activity that was initially conducted within the AVSI forum. AVSI and its membership, including industry and folks from the FAA, also put together a high-level report, and AVSI and its membership met with the FCC to sensitize them of the potential issues that may come to play when this band is utilized by 5G and LTE systems. And pursuant to those discussions with the FCC did acknowledge in its March 2020 report and order that further study was necessary to address coexistence between radar altimeters and 5G systems. But at this point in time, they had not shared any information on possible operating limitations to account for the safety and the operations of radar altimeter systems. So that essentially set forth the need for us to go ahead and do a deep dive on what these issues are and what could happen in the future if 5G systems were to operate right next to the band where radar altimeters operate at 3.7 to 3.98 gigahertz. So given that backdrop, within RTCA in April of 2020, we concluded that we'll have to start working on the evaluation of this interference impacts, and RTCA SC239 established a special task force. It is to note that the SC239 was a relatively nascent working group that was set forth initially to look into evaluating what is needed for a next generation radar MOPS. But given the alacrity with which we have to address this issue, RTCA went ahead and established a special task force to evaluate the impacts to radar altimeter from 5G systems in the adjacent band. And there was a fair amount of work that was performed within the auspices of SC239. It was a multi-stakeholder group, and it was open for public participation, i.e. anybody from industry can look to register and participate in the activities within SC239, and it was open to membership as well as people who were not members of RTCA. And at the end of the activity in October 2020, SC239 released a public report and provided that report to the FCC, and there was an adjoining ex parte presentation that was made to the FCC, which can be found on the FCC website as well. So having set that background, let's talk about what the crux of the issue is. As you see on the left, on the top left, you have a pictorial that depicts the current situation spectrum-wise in the band near the radar altimeters. Radar altimeters, as mentioned earlier, occupy the 4.2 to 4.4 gigahertz, and as you can see in that pictorial, you have between 3.7 and 4.2 gigahertz, you have FS, which is a fixed satellite and fixed satellite service satellite emission spectrum that is right below the radar altimeter system. Now, with the FCC RNO, whenever it goes into effect and 5G LTE systems start rolling out their base stations and start transmitting that band, you will expect to see a high-powered system in the band below radar altimeters between 3.7 and 3.98 gigahertz. In order to facilitate these high-powered systems in the band right next to radar altimeters, FCC has incentivized FSS providers to move out of that band and move into the band between 4 and 4.2 gigahertz. So you would still have transmissions in the band between 4 and 4.2 gigahertz. That would typically be fixed satellite systems, and you would see that there is additional emissions, which are spurious emissions, out-of-band emissions, that would fall from the base station transmissions that happen at 3.7 to 3.98 gigahertz into the band between 3.98 and all the way up and above the 4.4 gigahertz. Now, it is to note, as Seth mentioned earlier and as John Luke alluded to, that there isn't a specific out-of-band rejection requirement for TSO radar altimeters. And if you dial the clock back and look at what was in that band when we started to set, we did not have high-powered base station systems. In fact, when these standards were set, cellular telephones did not exist. So that being said, when you're looking at the existing situation in the top part of the slide, you see that you have a radar altimeter certified safety of life system that's operating in the 4.0 to 4.4 gigahertz band, and what's in the adjacent band is a low power spectral flux density system. And we're looking to essentially rezone the neighborhood and change the characteristics of the power spectral flux density in the neighborhood from a low power system to a high power system. And the concern that SC239 had put forth is that these high powered systems would typically cause a fair amount of receiver blocking for the receive part of the radar altimeter systems. And we'll get into the details in the next slides. So this is a high-level overview of the study approach that was espoused by SC239. SC239 looked at what information was available in order to perform the evaluation of the potential impacts from 5G and LTE systems radar altimeters. On the top left, you can see that we leverage the existing industry standards, and these are aviation industry standards and telecom industry standards and ITU standards. We took additional input and information on the specific 5G technical characteristics that were provided by CTIA and telecom participants of what was called the Technical Working Group 3, which was set forth in order to address compatibility concerns between aviation systems and 5G systems. That was a separate technical working group, and we obtained input from that working group into the multi-stakeholder forum that has been set forth under RTCA SC239 to perform the specific evaluation of impacts to 5G from 5G systems to radar altimeters. And on the bottom left, you see that we took input on radar altimeter technical characteristics that were provided by the aviation industry that typically designs, manufactures, and fields these radar altimeters. So all these inputs were fed into two categories of items. We took inputs from the 5G technical characteristics and the radar altimeter systems and performed empirical evaluation of thresholds. And these are the thresholds up till which you can operate these radar altimeters in the presence of 5G interference. And this was performed across a suite of different radar altimeters. We evaluated up to 9 radar altimeters from different manufacturers, and these 9 different model types were subject to interference testing based on the 5G technical characteristics that were provided. And we came up with empirical interference thresholds that we would need to pay heed to in order to operate these TSO radar altimeters in a safe manner. So that's what you see on the bottom of the chart in the green box. In the gray box above, we leverage the input from the 5G systems and input from industry standards to evaluate how much of power you would see from a given base station or a given handset in specific configurations with different antennas at different points in space. So essentially you have 2 inputs that are coming into play here. One is the actual intrinsic evaluation of how much interference that these radar altimeters can tolerate at different frequency offsets from the radar altimeter band. And this is interference that would emanate in the 3.7 to 3.98 gigahertz. We did testing taking 100 megahertz chunks of bandwidth that base stations can use for their 5G transmissions, and we essentially tested all the way across 3.7 to 3.98 gigahertz. So that's the intrinsic radar altimeter empirical interference tolerance threshold, and then you take that threshold and you bounce that against how much power you would potentially see from these base stations for the given EIRP that these base stations are authorized up to, and at different look angles from the base stations based upon the antenna patterns and at different altitudes and distances from the base stations. So essentially we have 2 parts to this. One is an analytical part and one is an actual testing part. And the way we've set up this activity is such that once we have this data that we have collected now through the auspices of the SC239 activity that's been supported by the AVSI testing activity, we are able to now bounce it against the analysis part that you see on the top part of the chart in the gray box. So as we move forward, if industry were to go ahead and evaluate what the impact to radars that are TSO today would be from a different base station layout or a different level of power from these base stations, we have all the information that we need based on the empirical testing that was done, and you'll have to bounce it against the simulation and analysis that you would get from an updated set of assumptions that would be reflective of what we have in this gray box. Now, the output of that is to identify the scenarios where you would expect, based on the existing assumptions of base stations and layouts, where you would expect impacts to radar altimeter systems, and we'll get into that in the next couple of slides. And as indicated in one of the earlier slides, the way we've been analyzing the impacts to radar altimeter systems is based upon the ICAO guidelines. We were looking to analyze the worst case impacts under ICAO guidelines of safety margins. Now, as you can see in this slide, this talks about what's called a usage category 1. When we did this evaluation of impacts to radar altimeters, we looked at what are the different CONOPS under which we see impacts to radar altimeters, and we essentially broke down the trade space of radar altimeters into 3 categories. We called them usage categories 1 through 3, and usage category 1 reflects the radar altimeters that are utilized on commercial air transport aircraft and on commercial large big iron cargo transport aircraft. And usage categories 2 and 3 reflect the relatively smaller business and regional aircraft and general aviation in the category 2, and usage category 3 typically reflects the helicopter platforms and other rotorcraft platforms. Now, looking at the specific details of impact to usage category 1, as you can see on the plots on the right side top, you see as indicated that there are red dots in a specific set of regions in this chart, and based upon the assumptions on the base stations, in this case for the usage category 1, if you take a urban base station assumption which has its associated EIRP levels, and you take a 16 by 16 active antenna array system with a -30-degree vertical scan, and you have a straight in and level approach case where you have your aircraft straight and level, and there's 0-degree aircraft pitch or roll. So essentially you're coming in for an approach, and at that point you see that based on the assumptions of these 5G systems, for a distance of anywhere between 0 to 0.4 miles between the base station and the aircraft, all the way up to an altitude of about 4,000 feet, you see that the interference levels from these base stations under the current base station EIRP and antenna pattern assumptions that were afforded us by the telecom industry, you would have interference at the input of the radar altimeter at the aircraft that is in excess of the safe levels. And I'll get into the details of what that safe level means in the next chart, but this is to note that based upon a specific antenna pattern assumption and specific scan angles, you would anticipate a high level of interference that is in excess of what the safe limit is for radar altimeter operation. Now, the trade space of the different base station layouts that impact the usage category 1 is limited, but from a cost function perspective, even though the trade space is limited, the impact is severe, because when you're looking at usage category 1 aircraft, if you have a unreliable radar altimeter signal return that is being interpreted by the radar altimeter, and that can cause multiple different things that include loss of function, and this is loss of critical function. It could potentially cause hazardously misleading information, and that is not desirable because the output from the radar altimeter sensor is coupled into a variety of critical aircraft systems that include flight controls, terrain avoidance, cockpit displays, and autopilot. And given that this is an extremely critical sensor for the purposes of performing your approach, landing, all the way down to touchdown, you could potentially have catastrophic impacts, and that can essentially lead to multiple fatalities on the ground. So from that perspective, it is extremely crucial to take a strong look at the impacts from these 5G base stations to radar altimeter systems for these usage category 1 aircraft and the other usage categories as well. It is to note that the impacts are relatively lesser for usage category 1. We don't anticipate any specific impacts from spurious emissions of these 5G systems for usage category 1 aircraft at this time, based upon the assumptions that we have, but we do expect impacts from the adjacent band to the radar altimeter system, which is the 3.7 to 3.98 gigahertz. So if you have transmissions of 5G base stations from the 3.7 to 3.98 gigahertz in the adjacent band, these fundamental transmissions that could cause blocking of the receive system of the radar can potentially cause a situation where you could have a catastrophic impact to the ground under these base station assumptions. So that being said, let's talk about what we see for the other two categories in the next couple of slides. So having spoke about category 1, let's look at usage categories 2 and 3. And as you see at the top of the screen on the left, usage categories 2 reflect the business aviation and the general aviation of the regional transport planes, and category 3 is typically the transport and general aviation helicopters. We've stated that this would typically be helicopters, but as we move forward, you could expect to see a variety of unmanned aircraft as well, using radar altimeters for their operations. So it's essentially rotorcraft and possibly unmanned aircraft as well that will be using radar altimeters here in the future. Now, unlike the limited cases that we looked at from the perspective of addressing the possible concerns of interference from 5G systems or radar, there is a huge number of cases that are involved when you're looking at usage categories 2 and 3. And that is an artifact of what the CONOPS of these categories are, in addition to the exposure of some of these radars to adjacent band interference systems. When it comes to CONOPS, you can see that if you potentially have a helicopter medevac system that is looking to go ahead and land atop the roof of a hospital, or it's going to have to land in certain zones to go ahead, pick up patients who are critically injured and they have to be transported back to the hospital, they are looking to land the helicopter pretty much where they can, and these could be in urban areas, and you can essentially have a flight path that's right through the main beam of these 5G/LTE base stations. So given that a priori, I'd like to get into the details of what the slide over here shows. And if you can focus on the pictorial in the slide, you see that there is a solid black line at the bottom around the -78 dBm per megahertz range. Now that solid black line is what's called a interference tolerance mask. That essentially says that as a function of altitude, you could see that there is a level of power spectral density that should not be exceeded by the power transmissions as seen at the input of the radar altimeter at the aircraft, and that is a level that is seen in black here that would ensure that you would make sure that you don't have a safety impact to the radar. Now the black line is now supported by a shaded area in pink in there, and that is to show the safety margin from a ICAO standard perspective, and as seen in the ICAO 9718 handbook, we typically have a 6 dB safety margin for safety of life systems. So although the interference tolerance mask is the stress case mask that shows that level at which you can reach and have interference up to the point where you don't have a safety issue on the radar, in order to ensure that you're accounting for variations in path loss, you're accounting for multipath, you're accounting for the safety criticality at whatever levels you have to address on the aircraft. So you may have some systems that are critical down to 1E-9 per hour, some systems that are critical at 1E-5 per hour. We have a safety margin for aviation systems. So essentially the ask from aviation is any transmission that can show up at the input of these radar altimeters on the aircraft for the categories 2 and 3, and especially in this figure for category 2, should be at or below the bottom end of that pink zone that you see on the slide. Now that's the reference point from a safe operation perspective. What you see right above in that plot are curves as a function of different assumptions that were made and the reflection of the simulation results that go along with those assumptions. So let's pick one of those curves over here. We can pick the one in dotted blue that essentially talks about expected 5G interference levels. That essentially reflects a rural 16x16 active antenna system. So with the 65 dBm EIRP that you have for the existing base station 5G LTE assumptions. If that base station were to use a 16 by 16 active antenna system and it uses the power levels for the rural rollout versus the urban rollout, that is the curve that depicts the amount of power that you'll be seen at the radar altimeter receive port on the aircraft as a function of aircraft altitude. And then you have a slew of other curves that reflect the 8x8 active antenna system for the urban zones, and they have the suburban 8x8 active antenna system, they have the 16x16 antenna systems, you have sectoral systems. So we have a variety of different antenna assumptions that we vetted with the CTIA stakeholders. And as you can see here, any and all of these assumptions in conjunction with the fundamental EIRP that's afforded in the FCC RNO will be a threat to platform categories 2 and 3. So from that perspective, we have a substantial concern of receiver blocking from the adjacent band transmissions. And it is to be noted that in this case, there is a concern with 5G spurious emissions as well. It is not just the underlying receiver blocking impact on the radar from fundamental transmissions in the adjacent band. We also see that there is a substantial concern from emissions from these 5G systems in the adjacent band that could fall right into the middle of the radar altimeter band, which is a 4.2 to 4.4 gigahertz band. Now, when it comes to a situation where you're dealing with the emissions from out of band that falls into your main band, there isn't a whole lot the radar altimeter systems can do. Even if you have any additional filtering in future radar altimeter designs, that is not going to help, because this is energy that falls right in the middle of the radar altimeter band that is being used to process the returns from the radar altimeter pings. And with that, we can go to the next slide. We're looking into discussing the continuation of these efforts and where we're going from here, at which point I'd like to turn it over to Jean-Luc Robin.
Okay, thank you very much, Sai, and thank you very much, Seb, for this thorough presentation. Now we know why radio altimeters are so much important for the aircraft. We know why we have to struggle with new radio frequency environment, and what is the challenge that is ahead of us. So what is the next step now? So we have created RTCA SC239 jointly with EuroCAE Working Group 119 in order to define and to develop a new MOPS in order to specify the interference tolerance requirements in order to have a resilient radio altimeter in the future. But while this MOPS will be revising, the current fielded radio altimeter will still be exposed to 5G interference. So this is the problem we have to cope with today. So what will the FCC do? Actually, aviation industry has proposed some mitigation to be implemented for 5G in 5G deployment, but the outcome is uncertain, and we are waiting for FCC answer. What will the FCC do? So depending on the FCC answer, so we don't know today. It's unclear what FAA will do if we will have some mitigation mean, or if we will not have mitigation mean. So this is what conclude this presentation, and I thank you everyone for your attention, and we'll give the stage back to Thierry.
Well, thank you, Jean-Luc. Great presentation. My name is Terry McManus. I am the President and CEO of RTCA. I'd like to first add my welcome to everyone for joining us today. Also want to take a moment to thank the sponsors for today's webinar, Collins Aerospace, NBAA, American Airlines, and Garmin. Putting on these webinars just wouldn't be possible without their support, so we thank them. I do want to remind everyone that on the handout sections of this platform, there are a number of things that you can download, including the slides that were used in the presentation. And there's also a link to a great video rendition of our report that an Emirates Airbus A380 captain has put together. Again, you can access those documents just by clicking in that handout section. So with that, I'd like to invite the presenters back on to start a little bit of question and answer period. So Jean-Luc, Seth, Cy, welcome you back. Thank you again, guys, for just a wonderful presentation. A lot of good work here. Somebody told me a long time ago that without facts and data, you're just another person with an opinion. So can you guys kind of run me through and the audience through a little bit about the data that was used, who provided that data, and a little bit of background?
Yeah, I think I can kick us off a little bit there. Terry and Cy and Jean-Luc may have a little bit to add. But as we mentioned in the presentation, the testing efforts that were conducted in support of the SC239 study were carried out by AVSI, the Airspace Vehicle Systems Institute at Texas A&M. They were a great help in that effort, and they were, a natural choice given that they had already conducted some previous radar altimeter testing for other interference cases. So they already had several of the altimeter models available. They already had a test bench that could be used with just a few minor tweaks. And the data that was ultimately provided from AVSI to SC239 consisted of data sets that took all of the measured tolerance thresholds across a given usage category. So I believe there were a total of 9 altimeter models that were tested. 5 of those were applicable to usage category 1 only, and the other 4 were applicable to both usage categories 2 and 3. So for each of the 3 usage categories, AVSI basically merged all of the test data into a single combined tolerance threshold, which represented the worst case performance of any of the altimeters in that usage category. And that served the needs of the SC239 study very well, because the way we scoped our study was to identify if there were any interference risks to currently fielded TSO authorized radar altimeters. We did not consider it within our scope to specifically identify which particular models may be susceptible to interference, but we instead wanted to focus on the different aircraft platform types and see if there was any risk as a starting point. So that was kind of the approach that was taken. It made it very easy in that regard for AVSI to share that data with RTCA for the purposes of our study. And from a technical standpoint, that was certainly sufficient for our needs.
Yeah, just to add to that, Terry, there was additional data that industry had collected on representative antennas as well that was used as part of the modeling and simulation effort. And this was used in conjunction with what information that we have today in ITR M2059 to provide a more representative value of antenna selectivity across the band that would be in turn used for the modeling and simulation to evaluate the overall power that we see at the radar altimeter.
Did some of that data come from the telecommunications industry itself?
Yeah, absolutely. It's what I would like to add also is that the data are also coming from 5G telecommunication industry, and mainly T-Mobile, AT&T, and Verizon, that provide us with a reasonable assumption of what is typical today as a 5G signal. So we also use this as an input.
Okay. The original order that was published by the FCC stated that 220 megahertz of separation from the radar altimeter operations were going to be sufficient to protect aeronautical services in that 4.2 to 4.4 gigahertz band. Why does this RTCA report show that that wasn't correct?
Maybe I can start a little bit, or maybe I can start to say something very quick. So the 200 megahertz ground band is about the spurious unwanted emission, but we discovered that we have also a blocking radio frequency phenomenon at the input of our receiver, so that the fundamental power outside the band is so high that the receiver front-end module are saturated.
Yeah, just to add to what Jean-Luc mentioned, when the FCC RNO was penned, there wasn't detailed empirical receiver testing tolerant masks available. So when we looked at the information, the FCC RNO, in conjunction with other submittals that were made to the FCC by other telecom stakeholders, it was evident that a detailed evaluation of the TSO radar sensitivity has not been done for interference that would emanate in the 3.7 to 3.98 gigahertz band. So when AVSI and its stakeholders provided the initial set of results to the FCC, it was clear that additional work needed to be done to resolve this concern. And in that context, within RTCA, we took upon this effort to go ahead and do a deep dive and test these radar altimeter models that are TSO'd in an exhaustive fashion. And whilst we were doing that, we got more information on the parameters of the telecom rollout that would happen in the future. And we realized that the spurious emissions, similar to what Jean-Luc has mentioned, were substantially higher. And based on the RNO, if those spurious emissions were to be found in the environment when we are operating radar altimeters, we would expect to see a substantial amount of power show up in the radar band. So whilst we started looking at this from the perspective of addressing possible radar receiver blocking, we also saw that there's substantial spurious emissions that would impact platform categories 2 and 3, and that was a completely new item that we discovered pursuant to performing this deep dive activity. So in the context of where we were at, Terry, when the FCC RNO was penned, and having obtained additional data from telecom stakeholders and evaluating the intrinsic radar altimeter receive system performance from an empirical fashion, it is absolutely true that we needed to have this RTCA and AVSI activity take place to provide clarity on what the technical impacts are. Over.
Right, and just to add a little bit more on that, so the FCC order, when they said that they think 220 megahertz should be enough guard band, there wasn't really any supporting data or analysis provided by the FCC directly. So there was no opportunity either for the aviation industry to make an assessment of that claim and ensure that the correct assumptions and data were being used as inputs. So that was a kind of a concerning thing that we saw there, especially as we conducted the study within SE239 and found a very different conclusion. And it's, 220 megahertz certainly sounds like a lot of guard band. In many other contexts, it certainly is. But the radar altimeters are inherently very wideband systems. They typically will utilize nearly 200 megahertz of bandwidth themselves in the receiver. So speaking in terms, relative to the actual utilized bandwidth of the radar system, it's not as much guard band as it would sound like. And in particular, most of the radar altimeters that are currently fielded and have TSO authorizations were designed, many years or decades ago without any specific requirements for tolerating out-of-band interference with any amount of guard band. So it's our position with the FCC has always been that we recognize that the spectrum environment is changing. We're working to update our requirements to reflect that. But the fact of the matter is the data that we've seen in the radar altimeter testing is what it is. And that indicates there is going to be a potential risk of harmful interference, and that needs to be addressed because 5G rollout is going to happen at a quicker rate than the aviation industry can respond with new requirements and developing and certifying new hardware.
The approach that was taken in the analysis utilized a worst case scenario both for analyzing the radio frequency interference as well as the worst case landing scenarios. Some might say that this is being overly conservative and doesn't depict a real world situation. Why was this approach taken in the analysis?
I can give some first element of answer. Terry, this is a very good question. Actually, we took two margin, one to account for the dispersion of hardware component, and the second one for safety. So for the first one, regarding the dispersion of hardware component, we have taken this margin to account to the fact that we only test one serial number unit. So we tested 9 radio altimeter, but we only account each time for one serial number unit. And so we have also to account with the temperature, because in laboratory it's 25 degrees, so we have to account for that. And deeper measurements that are ongoing today on several serial number reveals today that those 6 dB margin are likely to be probably too much optimistic. So due to mainly roll-off and cutting frequency. And for the safety margin, so the safety margin, ICAO safety margin, is needed to account for unknown, but it's largely justified because, for instance, we did not account for base station located on the top of a mountain or on the top of a building. We only account for one base station mast. We only tested one modulation, one 5G modulation with one separate subcarrier. And we were also in a perfect radio frequency environment in laboratory. And we also, for instance, use active antenna model, the 2101, that is probably also optimistic.
Seth, I think it was in your introductory parts about radar altimeters. You talked about the two different types of radar altimeters. Are there any expectation that those pulse mode radar altimeters in general are less or more susceptible to this interference phenomena?
Sure. So as I did mention in that intro, at least in civil aviation, pulsed altimeters are far less common these days. They used to be a little more common than they are now. Although there's also non-civil aviation use cases with military aircraft, and in that arena, pulsed altimeters are actually far more common than FMCW altimeters. So there still are quite a few military altimeters, or pulsed altimeters rather, flying today. And the SC239 report didn't specifically consider military altimeters due to a variety of reasons, and the time constraints that we had to try to get the report out. There's not much from a technical perspective that would indicate one of the technologies is going to be inherently more susceptible than the other. Of the 9 radar altimeter models that were tested by AVSI, I believe 1 was pulsed, and all of the remaining 8 were FMCW. So there's not a whole lot that can be gleaned from that test data. But one thing I will say is that the topology of a pulsed radar architecture does generally make it a little easier to mitigate any out-of-band interference with either a retrofit or a redesign to include a more aggressive bandpass filter roll-off response in the receiver front end. from a technical standpoint, that may not be a feasible solution for all FMCW radar altimeter designs, because in that case, inserting such a filter may impart some imperfections within the radar altimeter bandwidth, such as group delay variation, which can have some other impacts to both sensitivity and accuracy performance. So generally, while there may not necessarily be anything inherent in the design that makes one more susceptible than the other, I think, at least for the out-of-band blocking case, it may be something that's easier to mitigate with a pulsed altimeter design than with FMCW.
Got a question here, kind of more from an operational standpoint. If the aircraft is moving at an approach speed, you're going to quickly move away from the source of the interference. So in that case, that interference would be fairly short-lived. Would the radar altimeter be able to recover from that interference?
So it depends on the model, but we have to know that the transparent time of autopilot and flight control are more about in the order of hundreds of milliseconds, and the radio altimeter refresh rate is 50 milliseconds. So yes, we have to react very quickly upon an erroneous radio altimeter value.
So Terry, I think the bigger picture response on that one is it depends on the type of integration. Some platforms have a additional level of filtering that they utilize. Some platforms utilize the unfiltered radar altimeter output as well. So depending upon platform integration, the impact is going to be varied.
Right, and to add to that a little more, operationally, a very brief interference event may not necessarily be as impactful directly in terms of causing hazardously misleading information or a complete loss of function on the aircraft, but it may become an availability issue. In some avionics systems, an event that brief may cause the pilots to be informed that they cannot perform an autoland. You could also potentially have an erroneous indication from another system like a ground proximity warning system. So the pilots, for instance, could have a whoop-whoop pull-up enunciation in the cockpit, which is something that they need to take very seriously and respond to. So there's certain system-level aspects beyond the radar altimeter that have to be considered there as well.
We're at the end of the hour. I'm going to take on a couple of more questions, but we do have all the questions that have been submitted and who submitted them, and we'll get those to the panelists and attempt to get back to those of you that have asked some questions that haven't been answered here today. But I'll just two more questions. One is regarding the information about the altimeter performance data that wasn't considered. So a lot of critics have said that because individual radar performance data wasn't considered in our analysis, and it should have been, how has that impacted, do you think, the analysis on, and can you describe maybe a little bit about how that testing was done and why having that individual radar performance wasn't necessary?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit, Terry. So, as I mentioned, the data that was provided from AVSI to RTCA for the purposes of the SC239 study consisted of measured data that had then been combined in the worst case sense across the different usage categories. So the actual underlying test data for individual altimeter models was not shared. And again, from the SC239 perspective, we didn't think that was necessary to have any underlying data because of how we scoped our study. Again, we were trying to identify whether there was going to be any risk of harmful interference to specific aircraft platform types, considering all of the different TSO authorized altimeter models that could be used on those platform types, and not begin to identify specific altimeter models that are more susceptible than others. So I would agree with those critics that identifying models that may be more susceptible is going to be something that needs to be done moving forward, potentially, if mitigations are needed. You would certainly want to know if you're an aircraft operator, if the particular altimeter model you're using is going to be affected or not. But that is something we consider to be outside the scope of the SC239 study and better suited to some follow-on activities.
And then just a final question. Has there been any other testing or analysis conducted by either the aviation industry or the telecommunications industry that has shown different results or conclusions from the RTCA or ABSI analysis?
Yeah, Terry, from the perspective of what has been shared in public, we have not seen any additional radar altimeter receive system testing. There's been some additional information that's been shared by filings by other stakeholders, but that has not been backed by a detailed report similar to what we have seen through the auspices of RTCA SC239. So at this time, the only authoritative report that has been vetted in the open is the one that came out of RTCA SC239 in support of this activity and being supported with data input from the ABSI testing activity. Over.
Well, thanks. Again, we've got a lot of questions and we couldn't get to all of them in the time frame that we had, but again, we'll get answers to those questions and get them back out to those of you that have asked so that we can do the best we can to answer everybody's questions. I just want to add on a personal note. I know firsthand the significant importance of radar altimeters in an operating environment. I spent 30 years as an airline pilot, more than 17,000 hours as pilot in command, and I grew my teeth, if you will, in the airline industry. A small regional airline out of Colorado, flying passengers into and out of the ski areas like Aspen, Steamboat, Vail, and some other places, and oftentimes in some pretty nasty weather. In those operations, the radar altimeter was our lifeline. It ensured adequate terrain clearance and avoidance, along with some general situation awareness. Then when I moved to the major airlines, radar altimeters were a key required aid when viewing approaches during low visibility Category 2 and Category 3 operations. And as was pointed out in the presentation, they fed some very safety critical data into some of the other airplane systems. But my personal experience aside, I'm certainly aware that this reallocated spectrum issue has a lot at stake. There's a lot of energy, a lot of passion that many stakeholders have, both from aviation and from the telecommunications industry. But our goal was to set some of that emotion and passion aside and produce this report of technical truths by first assessing the potential interference impact on radar altimeters, and then longer term work to update the requirements for performance standards on future radar altimeters against the existing and planned future radio frequency environment. Now, we don't consider this a definitive one-time assessment with this report, but rather we consider it the basis for some ongoing work and analysis. At RTCA, we remain committed to model the operational environment with the best technical data available, and we're certainly open to completing additional testing and analysis, and even revising the results of this report if further inputs become available to us. Furthermore, we're committed to working together with the telecommunications industry in a proactive manner to find solutions that will advance the use of technology, while at the same time ensuring the safety of the traveling public. My thanks again to the panel, Jean-Luc, Seth, and Cy. Thanks to our sponsors, Collins Aerospace, MBAA, American Airlines, and Garmin. And again, this presentation will be available on the RTCA YouTube channel in the next day or so. And to everyone in the audience, thank you for sharing part of your day with us. We appreciate your attendance today. Our next webinar is currently scheduled for Wednesday, January 20th at 1 p.m. Eastern. And details about this webinar are going to be made available in the next couple of weeks. I hope you'll all be able to join us. So thank you and have a great day.
Good afternoon. This is Kyle Welch with RCR Wireless News. Thank you for attending Interference Hunting for Improved Quality of Experience, presented by Rohde & Schwartz. Our presenter today is Paul Denisowski, Application Engineer at Rohde & Schwartz. Just a reminder that within 24 hours of this webinar, we will provide you with a link to the on-demand version of today's webinar. During the webinar, we encourage you to submit questions via the control panel, which will then be answered towards the end of the presentation. With that being said, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Paul.
Well, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Denisowski. I'm an Applications Engineer for Rohde & Schwartz, and what I'll be presenting today is interference hunting for improved quality of experience. Now, obviously, the first thing I'd like to talk about, I'd like to define quality of experience. Quality of experience essentially is defined as the performance of a system as seen or perceived by the end users or customers. Now, as RF performance engineers or people involved in RF at a technical level, we tend to think of radio frequency interference and quality of service in terms of statistics. So things like RSSI, signal-to-noise ratio, bit error rate. We tend to think of quality of service in terms of actual metrics, KPIs that we can measure. The reality is, however, that users are usually not particularly concerned with these type of metrics. They're interested in things such as voice quality or data throughput. So it's important for us to begin by understanding that users don't necessarily see these parameters or don't perceive them as something that's important. While we may be very concerned with what the noise floor is in a certain part of town, this is not something that the users normally see and perceive. Now, there are a number of different parameters that are important that are related to quality of experience. So I'd like to talk about each one of them briefly. One is coverage or service availability. This is essentially where you have coverage or where you're able to use a wireless service. A wireless service could be the best service in the world, but if you're unable to actually use that service, it's really not much of a use to you. There's reliability of the system availability. This is how well the system works, especially under adverse conditions. As we go further through the presentation, you'll see that by adverse conditions, what we really are referring mostly to is interference here. And the last one is performance. That is the actual throughput of data, voice quality, and other metrics like that. And all of these tie together to build what the user perceives as quality of experience. Now, what impacts quality of experience? There are basically three main areas that impact how a user sees quality of experience. And these are services and applications, devices, and the network itself. Now, the network is an easy part for most of us to understand. The network is the infrastructure that provides the wireless services. To service providers, these would be, of course, base stations, etc. On the device side, these are the user devices. Again, in a cellular networking environment, these would be phones, UEs, user equipment. And then services and application probably deserves a little bit more explanation. These are the applications actually running on the device or on the phone. And there are interactions between all three of these. For example, it's very clear to most people probably on this webinar, the interaction between the device and the network. Does the phone talk to the network? Do they interoperate properly over different vendors, different supply issues that are involved in the communication between those two? That will impact quality of experience. Likewise, there's an interaction between the network and the service and application. There are some applications that may be very bandwidth intensive or that put special loads on the network, and these have to be considered as well. There's also an interaction between the service and applications and the device. And again, this is how well the device runs certain applications or the impact that certain applications have on devices. Battery life would be a good example of this. Where all three of these areas come together is where we define quality of experience. And to give you a practical example of this, VoLTE, Voice over LTE, is an example of where all three of these components is very important in quality of experience. For example, if you want to have a VoLTE call You're going to need a network that can support VoLTE, that can do prioritization if necessary. You need devices that can support it, because not all devices are created equal. And you also need services and applications running on the UEs, in this case, the VoLTE application. And these, again, will not be equal. All of these together will contribute into what we consider to be quality of experience. And this is very important for the user. Now, for this presentation, for this webinar, we're going to be concentrating mostly on the devices and networks. Since, again, as people working in doing interference hunting in an RF environment, this is where we have the most opportunity to find improvements or to combat problems in the network. So why is quality of experience important? I'd like to talk about, again, mostly from a cellular networking point of view, but it can be applied to other ones as well. Why is quality of service important? Quality of service is basically or quality of experience rather, is basically the prime differentiator in commercial networks. In the days before, for example, LTE, we had different radio access technologies. 3G, you could have WCDMA, you could have UMTS. What we have now with a lot of people moving towards LTE, or essentially everyone moving towards LTE, is that we're essentially using the same radio access technology. So what makes provider A or equipment vendor A better than provider or equipment vendor B? It's going to be quality of experience. These will affect how people make decisions about what's a good and a bad network, whether they're happy with a service, etc. This also applies to non-commercial networks. For example, for government, military, public safety applications, what you'll see is the quality of service or quality of experience is very important here as well. And there are two main factors that go into quality of experience, again, from an RF and interference hunting level, and that's system or device design and resource planning, as well as the RF environment. And again, our webinar today is going to focus mostly on the RF environment component. So why is interference hunting important for quality of experience? Well, interference affects quality of experience by degrading the RF environment of wireless systems. A wireless system, obviously, that has to operate in a degraded environment will have a poorer quality of experience, normally speaking, than one that has an ideal RF environment. As all of you probably know, spectrum is a very expensive and very limited resource. There's only so much spectrum, and there's a limit to how much information can be pushed over a certain bandwidth with a certain noise floor, a certain signal-to-noise ratio. And therefore, it's imperative that we use this spectrum efficiently. Resolving interference is generally, I would say always, but I'll say generally here, almost always more cost-effective than if we try to increase performance. There are some cases in which if you have poor coverage or you have interference issues, you overcome by essentially more infrastructure, more towers, bigger antennas, more gain, etc. However, there are many cases in which interference is at such a level or so severe that no amount of infrastructure changes can overcome it. And in this case, there will be a definite negative impact to quality of experience if interference is in fact present. Now, LTE I'd like to talk about because LTE has really raised the bar for interference and the levels of interference that are tolerable. Many of you may have worked on older 2 or 3G cellular networks. This also applies to older analog radio networks. If you're in a public safety role, for example, and have used analog trunking radios versus something digital like P25. LTE has raised the bar for interference because, first of all, it's become very widely deployed. LTE is being used by network operators, it's being used by military, government, public safety, etc. And it's become a worldwide standard. You have to assume that you can have LTE access for radios all over the world, and it's rapidly becoming that way in pretty much every place that you would visit. The downside to LTE is, of course, that it requires a much cleaner RF environment. Compared to 2 and 3G technologies that were more robust in the face of interference, LTE has a much lower tolerance, if you will, for interference because, again, LTE, in order to provide the higher speeds, higher data rates, but shorter round-trip times, it requires a much cleaner RF environment. So interference that might have not have been an issue for older cellular networks are now a much bigger issue for LTE. In other words, we have interference at levels that might not have bothered us in previous technologies. There are other aspects to LTE that are also important. For example, the use of remote radio heads. In doing interference hunting prior to the use of remote radio heads, one could often go to the eNode B, or rather the space station, and plug into the RF sniffer port and actually look at the spectrum as seen by the antennas mounted on the top of a tall tower with gain. Unfortunately, with a remote radio head, which is at the top of the tower and which feeds the rest of the network through a fiber optic cable, we no longer have that access to the RF. We can no longer see the RF that the tower saw. And what this often forces us to do is to drive the area. We can no longer say, what does this look like? We have to actually go out in the field, in the area that's being covered by that cell or by that sector and drive the area. There's also some challenges with regards to the next version of LTE, LTE Advanced, one of the big characteristics of which is carrier aggregation. We're going to see spectrum being used in chunks or blocks that are aggregated together to provide higher throughput. And what this means is that interference issues can affect our overall throughput, even though they may be located in different frequency ranges, different aggregated carriers. So what are common sources of interference? One of the things that I enjoy the most about interference hunting is the variety of devices that can cause interference. Anyone who's done interference hunting for a long period of time knows that there's almost an endless supply of devices that will cause interference. But there are several common causes of interference I'd like to mention. The first and the most important one, I think, is other wireless services. The sad truth is that in many cases, it's one wireless service interfering with another. Not usually intentionally, but these kind of things do, in fact, happen. They're basic sort of RF characteristics or phenomenon, such as harmonics and intermodulation. These are common sources of interference, especially when you have high-powered transmitters or transmitters in close physical proximity. Faulty or misconfigured repeaters and amplifiers. This is the bidirectional amplifier, which has caused many problems in cellular networks, or other types of amplifiers that misbehave or can cause huge increases in the noise floor over many tens of megahertz, or it can cause signals that drift or wander over a certain frequency range, and therefore can be very difficult to locate or analyze. Serious emissions is any radiation from an electronic device that's non-intentional. Almost all electronics generate some radio frequency signals at certain frequencies. This would be the classic case of a plasma TV, for example, which generates signals that interfere with a cellular uplink. One of the things that's also come up recently in terms of spurious emissions is lighting balance. There's certain fluorescent lighting balance, unfortunately, that generate unacceptable levels of RF noise at frequencies used by many network providers. One very interesting and I think perhaps underestimated source of egress or source of interference has been cable leakage or egress. Cable television systems, as you probably know, use the same frequencies that cellular providers use for 700 megahertz. And what that's meant is that signals that egress or leak from a cable TV system can cause problems to cellular networks. This was not an issue before because there was very little frequency overlap between the systems, and also because, again, the slower and lower order modulation of previous cellular systems was more immune to this type of interference. You can also have unlicensed wrong band operations. It's always amazing to me how many people will transmit on frequencies that don't belong to them. This does continue to go on. And the last one is jammers or malicious interference. There is, of course, still a number of people out there who have jammers or other devices intentionally disrupting communications. And these obviously are a pretty severe source of interference because they're intended to interfere. So there are two steps in interference hunting. The first step in interference hunting is identifying that interference is present at all, and then trying to identify what that interference looks like. This is normally done by actually viewing the spectrum itself. The next step is, of course, finding the interference. We need to know where the interference is coming from, that is, which direction, which bearing, as we'll talk about, and also what kind of device is generating the interference. Identifying interference is obviously the first step in this. You have to know that interference is happening, that the problem is external, for example, to the system. It's helpful to know what the interference looks like, but that by itself is not sufficient. In order to successfully hunt and resolve interference, you have to physically find the source. You have to be able to actually put your finger on it and pull the plug, so to speak. It's usually not sufficient to say it's somewhere within this building. You actually have to say it's coming from this particular box. Now, the size, the shape, the location, the behavior of the interference can give you strong hints as to its location. As an example here on this slide, you'll see a picture of cable television egress. Cable television egress, as I mentioned in the previous slide, is when cable television signals leak into the over-the-air environment. And the good news is it's very easy to recognize. If you look at this slide, you'll see these 6 megahertz wide quam haystacks, and they're pretty regularly spaced, and you can see that they're always on, and they are very, very unique in terms of their spectral pattern. If you were to have an interferer, for example, in your uplink band, and you saw this would be a huge hint as to what you have to look for, because obviously there are a limited number of devices from which cable signals can escape. So if you see that the interferer looks like what you see here on the screenshot, you can limit your interference hunting activities to things like cables, amplifiers, repeaters, pedestals, and not worry so much about LCD billboards or other such devices. Now, I'd like to talk about interference hunting tools. I mean, one of the things that's important to understand about RF is it's something that we cannot as human beings normally sense without instruments. So in order to do interference hunting, you will need some kind of instruments that can sense RF and give you information about it. There's several specialized tools that are used in interference hunting. One of them is spectrum analyzers or monitoring receivers. I'll talk about the difference between those in a minute. Directional antennas is an extremely important component in interference hunting. It'd be very difficult to do interference hunting without a directional antenna. There's also direction-finding systems. These are systems that allow you to locate an interferer by simply giving it the frequency and perhaps some other parameters of the interferer. And knowledge bases. One thing that I think is underestimated in terms of tools or resources for people doing interference hunting is the vast body of knowledge that already exists in terms of interferers, what they look like, where they are, and how to resolve them. Another very important aspect in terms of interference hunting is having a good practical knowledge of certain things. RF in general is very important, but propagation, I think, is key. Knowing how signals travel, how they can get into or out of structures or out of enclosures is very important. Being aware of what's where in spectrum, the allocations, what kind of signals might you see, 800 megahertz, this is very important as well. And also methodologies, as just like all other technologies, as interference hunting has evolved over time, some methodologies that may have worked for older technologies no longer work, and there are continual advancements in the field. As we'll see, there are new methodologies and new tools coming out, and these are things that can be very helpful in resolving interference. Let me talk for a moment about spectrum analyzers versus monitoring receivers. There is a difference between them. It's often very difficult to tell what they are by looking at them. The spectrum analyzer is probably the tool that many of you are familiar with. It's based on the heterodyne or swept architecture, swept principle. If you have a device that has a sweep time, then that is a heterodyne-based instrument. Essentially, it sweeps a small window, a resolution bandwidth, if you will, across an area of spectrum, and it displays what that spectrum looks like. This is the traditional way of doing it. It works very well, makes very precise measurements. There are some limitations in using spectrum analyzers for doing interference hunting. Generally, they tend to be much slower than a monitoring receiver, and they may have, or rather they may not have, certain features that you may find in a dedicated monitoring receiver. On the other hand, spectrum analyzers also tend to be general purpose pieces of equipment, so they can be applied in a wide range of applications for interference hunting. Now, as interference hunting has grown in importance, you've also seen the development of new tools called monitoring receivers. These are not the traditional heterodyne swept receivers or instruments that you may be used to. These are actually based on an FFT architecture, where they take a block of spectrum, digitize it, do a Fourier transform, and then output the results. This means that they're very, very fast, and as we'll see in a few later slides, speed is very important in interference hunting for a variety of reasons. And typically, these are single-purpose instruments, where the spectrum analyzer may be applied for many different tasks. Monitoring receivers tend to be purpose-based and designed for interference hunting and spectral monitoring. I'd like to talk and spend a little bit of time on this slide because I think it's an important slide. It's the importance of speed in interference hunting. I'm often asked by people, why is speed important in interference hunting? And I think there are some misconceptions about this. Obviously, if you're looking for a bursty or intermittent signal, one that's very short duration, very, very quick pulses, then you would need a very fast instrument in order to be able to see that signal. That, however, is typically not a large source of interference in most networks. If a signal is only on the air for, say, 10 milliseconds really not on the air long enough to be an interferer. Why then is speed important in interference hunting, especially if we're looking at, for example, a CW, a continuous wave interferer, something that's on the air all the time? In this case as well, speed is very important. The reason that speed is important in interference hunting is essentially twofold. One is that the faster an instrument responds to signals, the more quickly you can move past that signal and not miss it. And let me give an example of what I mean by this. The example of the lower level interferers, which means we can't see it very well. We may not have access to the actual antenna system to be able to see it the way the tower sees it. So we're essentially forced to drive the area. Now, if this is a low-level interferer and we're driving the area at a reasonable speed, a speed, say, 30, 40, 50 miles an hour, and we pass by it, a slower instrument may not be able to see that interferer at all. So this would require us to either A, redrive the area in hopes that we hit it the next time, or drive much more slowly, perhaps at an unnaturally slow rate, in the hopes that we'll pass by the interferer. The other way that speed is important in interference hunting is what I will call the last 100 yards dilemma. Usually what will happen is you'll be able to get down to an area of maybe 100 yards or so, and then have to manually sweep the area with a handheld antenna. Again, if the instrument responds quickly, then you'll get an indication from the instrument, say, for example, an audible tone, or you'll see a change in level on the display, as soon as that antenna is pointed at the device that's generating the interference. On the other hand, with a slower instrument, you'll have trouble doing this because you'll have to move the antenna much more slowly. And as anyone who's done interference hunting knows, time is essentially money in interference hunting as well. You need to be able to resolve the interferer as quickly as possible. Now, I'd like to talk about directional antennas. I've had people ask me if it's possible to do interference hunting without a directional antenna, and my answer, quite frankly, is no. It's really a very, very important component of interference hunting. There are two general types of antennas that are used, handheld antennas, that are used in interference hunting. Yagis and what I'm going to call generically wideband antennas. Yagi antenna, there's a picture here on this slide. They generally have very good directionality. They have a very tight beam width. If you point it towards the source of interference, you get a much stronger response than if it's pointed away. And gain is relative to the number of elements that it has in it. And these antennas work very well. They tend to be very low cost, and again, good directionality and good gain. But that comes, as everything does, with a cost. Essentially, most Yagi antennas are what I like to refer to as deaf outside of their specified frequency range. So a Yagi antenna that's tuned, for example, for 850 megahertz may work reasonably well at 800 and 900 megahertz, but probably doesn't work very well at all at 700 or a gig, and is almost completely deaf when you get to, say, 400 megahertz. This is the drawback of using band-matched antennas, that if you're in the band of operation, they work very, very well. Once you get outside of that band, they work less well. Why is this important? Well, interference issues are often multi-band. For example, harmonics. A harmonic, of course, is a whole number multiple in frequency of a certain fundamental signal. I may see an interfere at, say, 800 megahertz that's actually the fourth harmonic of a signal at 200 megahertz. And, of course, the 200 megahertz signal will be stronger, and it will be easier to do direction finding you're locating on because it's higher amplitude. If I have an antenna that's only tuned for 800 and I try to look for something at 200, that's problematic because I have the quote-unquote wrong antenna. Likewise, you'll see some amplifiers, bidirectional amplifiers used in cellular systems, often may be multi-band. So you may have an amplifier that's causing wide raises at both 850 and 1900. Spurious emissions also can occur at a wide range of frequencies, and there are wideband noise sources. Jammers are an excellent example of a very wideband noise source that may extend over several hundred megahertz. Another aspect is spectral reforming. 700 megahertz exists because UHF TV channels were vacated from that frequency range, and we're going to see more of this as time goes on. This means that you have to be prepared as an interference hunter to look at various frequencies, different frequency bands, possibly separated by many tens or hundreds of megahertz. Antenna per band at that point becomes cumbersome and problematic. If you have to support 7 or 8 bands, it's really not practical to bring with you 7 or 8 Yagi antennas in the field. Now, there are antennas that are wideband antennas. There's a picture of one here. These often work on different physical designs, for example, a long periodic versus a Yagi antenna. Wideband or multiband antennas allow operation generally over a much wider frequency range. Now, again, there is a drawback to a wider frequency range in that their beam width tends to be wider. They're not as laser focused as a Yagi antenna might be. But again, the trade-off is that it requires you to only bring one antenna with you instead of 5, 6. The situation will determine which antenna combination is most appropriate for a given task. Now, with regards to direction finding, there's two major steps in radio location or direction finding, what I will call the geographic part and the local part. The geographic part is where you essentially drive around typically and try to get within, let's say, 100 yards, maybe 50 yards of the interfering source. So you want to have a general idea. It's coming from this building. It's coming from this set of apartments. It's coming from this set of utility poles. And then there's the local part where you actually have to go and figure out exactly what point, down to the inch, down to the device, that's generating the interference. And these require different approaches. Typically, for usually in the geographic approach, you drive an area looking for issues, and you'll take bearings. You'll say, I think the interferer is that way or this way. It has a bearing. It has a direction that it's located in. And these bearings or directions can be determined, as we'll see, manually or in an automated method. Then there's the local part, where you actually walk the area holding a handheld directional antenna and sweep the area, looking for the device or the point at which you see the maximum level of the interferer, and hopefully that's the device that you're looking for. Now, there's two methods of getting bearings. I mentioned before that the geographic part involves taking bearings. There's two methods of doing this. One is the manual method, and one is the automatic method. So the manual method of taking bearing, essentially the operator, you, are holding a directional antenna. Say this is a Yagi, maybe this is a wideband, depending on what you're doing. And you move the antenna around until you get the maximum signal level. That's typically the way that it's done. A bearing will, in this way, will then be plotted or saved and used in triangulation. There's also an automatic method of getting bearings where you have an instrument, a system, that you input a frequency and it automatically, based on characteristics of the incoming signal, it automatically computes the bearing line and then plots a line towards where the source of the signal, or plots a line towards the source of the signal. And I'll talk a little bit more about these in the next few slides. Now, a bearing by itself, a single bearing, is useful in the sense that it points you in the right direction, but it also has a limitation that it only tells you the direction. It doesn't tell you how far away the interferer is. I'm guessing many people on this call have had the experience that they do interference hunting of knowing that the interferer is in a certain direction and driving and driving and driving and driving and finding out that it's 10 or 15 miles away. This is what we would like to avoid. And one way that we can avoid this is by taking multiple bearings. Ideally, what you would do in this bearing-based method of direction finding, of geographic direction finding, is you go to a location and take a bearing. You say that the transmitter is in a certain direction. Then you go to some other location. Ideally, you'd like to try to get around where you think the interferer is and take another bearing. And you continue to take a certain number of bearings and hope that these cross in one location. And this would be triangulation. Typically, you need at least 2 or 3 lines to do triangulation. More is better up to a certain point. But there are some limitations on the triangulation approach in terms of taking bearings. First of all, the quality of your triangulation, the point that's calculated to be the likely source of the emitter, that point's accuracy is going to be based on the accuracy of the bearings that you take. If you take very good bearings, you should have a very good triangulation point. Less accurate bearings, a less accurate triangulation point. And again, one way that you can overcome this is by taking a large number of bearings and discarding what I will call flyers, bearings that obviously make no sense at all. Sometimes you'll get in a position, you'll take a bearing, and it's pointing completely in the opposite direction from all the other bearings. And this is where a certain amount of experience and human intelligence is required. Things would work very well and would lead us to a large number of interfering sources with one exception, and that's the problem with multipath. Multipath, as the name implies, is where a signal takes multiple paths to get from transmitter to receiver. For example, many of you may have sat in traffic at a traffic light listening to an FM radio station that sounds a little bit not so good. And you move the car, inch it forward a few inches, and it clears up. Why? It's multipath. You've moved far enough that you've canceled out the effects of receiving this radio signal from multiple directions with slightly different time delays. Now, multipath is a fairly substantial issue for interference hunting in urban areas, because in urban areas where you have lots of buildings or other structures which will reflect radio frequency signals, you'll receive the signal from multiple directions, and therefore it's very difficult to know which direction the transmitter is actually located in. Multipath is a problem for both manual and automatic bearing-based direction finding. The good news is, of course, that multipath, although it makes your life much more difficult in terms of direction finding, doesn't really